Welcome, everybody, and welcome those of you who are online on Zoom. I'm Jeff Knopf. I'm a professor here and chair of our MA program in Non-Proliferation and Terrorism Studies. And I'm very pleased to moderate this seminar today and to introduce our speaker. I met her on the academic conference circuit, I guess, for the last two ISA meetings, I think. Discovered that we have a lot of mutual friends and she's doing interesting work. And I said, well, why don't you come present some of that interesting work here in Monterey? So I'm pleased to introduce Shira Cohen. Shira is currently a PhD student in the political science department at University of California, Berkeley, where she specializes in international relations and methods. She's got a nice broad range of research interests, including military strategy, emerging technologies, and religion. And we'll kind of hear the intersection of those today. Shira got her BA in the honors track in security strategy and decision making, and then an MA in government at Reichman University in Israel, formerly known as IDC Herzliya, in case you are not current on the latest name changes there. She's worked as a research assistant at the Institute for the Study of Intelligence Methodology, the Israeli National Cyber Directorate, and the Strategic Planning Department at the IDF Planning Directorate. She's also a member of the International Student Young Pugwash Leadership Team. And among her publications, she's published an article on the first international crisis of AI in the West Point Journal of Politics and Security. And her talk today is on why do leaders use religious signals, the case of nuclear weapons.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for being here. I'm very excited. I have kind of, I think, unorthodox topic, which combine religion and, for today, nuclear weapons. This is a project that I've been working for the past year and a half now as part of my PhD in Berkeley, and is now developing to be my dissertation. Today, I will mainly show you kind of my theory on religious signals, what I call religious signals, and then a proof of concept. And I think it's in a nice stage right now that I would really appreciate any feedback in order to really develop this from now a length article project into a book project. So with saying that, so for the past couple of years, I've been seeing more and more state leaders who are using some religious rhetoric when they are sending some very clear messages. It could be like before, during, or after war, or big operation. So if you go back to President Bush right after 9/11, and you look at his speech to the American public, and you see how he concluded also some religious rhetoric within his speech. So, for example, he said that he was touched to see Democrats and Republicans join together and singing "God Bless America," that unite all of us together. And the last two large paragraphs at the end of his speech was only about God. It was that he indicated God is not neutral between cruelty and justice. And then he asked for God guidance, wisdom, and protecting the American people. And it's not only about America, there are also stuff that are going right now. So the clashes between Israel and Iran, you can see both leaders using this religious rhetoric before and after attacks. Okay, but it's not only religious rhetoric. I also have been seeing some religious riots. So Saddam Hussein in 1991, for example, and he was like pretty secular guy. But then in 1991, suddenly he decided to add up by himself Allahu Akbar, which is Allah is great, to the Iraqi flag. But then he also went to national TV and prayed. And then you can see how they broadcast this over and over again, even into stamps and postcards. So I've been asking myself, what is this thing? And I'm thinking that I think that there are two things in common to those incidents. First, they all carry some religious symbolism, but they also convey some private information on these leaders' resolve. Meaning, these are signals that carry religious symbolism, which I call religious signals. And I ask myself, if I see it over and over again, why do these leaders use religious signals? And spoiler alert, this is my bottom line, which will be because they are costly, and they are costly enough to convey this information in a credible way. And if they do it, they can achieve various effects, desired effects, such as from deterrence to increasing support for multiple audiences. So I know it's a bit mushy right now, but we'll get into this later. So the agenda for today, and the talk should take about 35 to 40 minutes talk, will be first to convince you that there is something about religion and nuclear weapon, because my case study for today will be nuclear weapon, even though I think this theory is much broader than this. Then we'll go to, so what religious signal is, I will define it, and who sends those religious signals. I will use the case of Russia in order to do this, as Russia, since the fall of the USSR, was intertwining religion specifically into its nuclear enterprise over and over again. It was very influential. So I thought it's a good case for this, just like to show you the theory that have like so many layers, to just like take one of my biggest case studies. And then I will ask what effects the religious signals have on different audiences. In other words, my research question, why they're using this. And I will use Pakistan as a case study to show you these effects. And at the end, I will wrap up everything and ask you for some thoughts on how to turn it out into your book project, which is my dissertation. So just to convince you first that there is something about religion and nukes. So 9 out of the 10 nuclear or threshold nuclear states at some point hold some religious symbolic names to their ballistic missiles, except China. So for example, you have Jericho, which is the so-called Israeli ballistic missiles that could carry potentially nuclear weapons. Jericho was the first city that the Israeli conquest when they entered Canaan. And it was like a miracle when it happened, like a miracle from God. But then you have also Ababil, which is the Pakistani nuclear missile. And Ababil is the birds in the Quran that protected the Kaaba in Mecca from invasion. And you have in India, Agni, which is in Sanskrit, fire, like the deity of fire. And it's also about names of nuclear tests. So, you know, Trinity, of course, and the smiling Buddha in 1974 in India. But it's not only names. In Russia, we can see that there are patron saints associated to nuclear weapons. So this guy is Sarafim Sarab, and he is the official saint for the nuclear Russian arsenal. But then I saw that there are some ceremonies, religious ceremonies, and sanctification in front of nuclear weapons. So at the top, you can see Russian priests, Orthodox priests, sparkling holy water on nuclear ballistic missiles. And on the bottom, you can see a puja ceremony right before a nuclear a test in the potential nuclear missiles. And I see this is only like a couple of examples. And then you go and see leaders, state leaders, who aren't religious necessarily, using this like religious rhetoric associated with nuclear weapon. And we will see specific example of this guy later on. And there are also some religious obligations. For example, fatwa, which is a Muslim religious obligation to do or not to do something. So for Iran, for example, they issued a fatwa on whether they can or cannot develop a nuclear weapon. So all of this to say that there is something about this connection of religion and nuclear weapon, and that's why this is my case for today. So going back to what religious signals are. This is my definition that changed about 100 times at this point, and probably will change 100 times again by the end of the dissertation, hopefully. So we'd love to hear your thoughts on this too. So religious signals are defined as first costly signals or communications. It's gonna be depends on the level that they are being sending, whether in international level or the domestic level, that carry religious symbolism and convey private information on the leader's resolve. So these are the things that you should notice. There are three components for religious signals that makes the signal religious, meaning separate it from non-religious signals, which is first, religious symbolism. Second, it's going to be costly, and it will associate all those costs that you know from IR literature as economic costs, social costs, political costs, but it can also have a potential divine cost. And then the leaders who will set it have to publicly present religious inclination, and we'll go one by one now and we'll conceptualize it together using the Russia case. I'm using two main literature, the IR literature, of course, but I figure out when I one day thought that might be something called religious signals, that actually there is signaling theory of religion, just not in our field. There is one in sociology and anthropology and even biology, which I was very surprised to figure out. And it's like 20 years now since it was first presented. But it's not in the international level. It's just like between specific religious leaders within a community. And I'm trying to bring it up first into the security field and second into the international arena. So first component, religious symbolism. So what is it? Religious symbolism is demonstrated by what I call sacred obligation. It's gonna be sacred obligation both to the divine, but also to your religious community. And put it simply, not theologically, in practice, this is gonna be just that a sender envelope signals with some religious connotations that show his devotion. This can be ranged from practices like pilgrimism, so you can see Putin here, going to the Holy Sepulchre in 2012, broadcasting this, publicly presenting this. And it can also be statement that we will see Putin do in a second. So first with this religious symbolism, so you just like show your devotion when you talk or when you are doing something like this. The second component is the cost. And this is a bit tricky because cost is very sensitive to all of us in IR. So first, I will say religious signals are costly as far as I understand. This cost stems for the desecration of this sacred obligation that we just mentioned, meaning that you are showing inconsistency with your religious devotion. And in simple words, it's just like that you are kind of breaking a contract between you and God and between you and the religious community as the sender. The punishment, therefore, will be, and I hope that you do not like get you to move uncomfortably, but I call them earthy receivers. So all those regular audiences that we know about, so it could be the adversary, the religious community, it could be anything that we already know. And then there is the punishment could be also for the divine. And therefore, because you are inconsistent with your religious devotion, and therefore you can be punished by the divine. And then the cost type will be all the things that we know, political, social, economic, etc., and a divine punishment. And this is from the STR literature that I mentioned before. This definition is based on Marcel Mauss's definition of religion that associate religious obligation to the mena, so to the divine, with some potential cost from both the divine and the religious community. So an example, I thought it will be helpful here. Right after the outbreak of Ukraine and Russia war, we can see this guy, which he is the highest religious authority in Russia. This is the Patriarch of Moscow, Kirill, and he started to make many statements about justifying the war in Ukraine right after its outbreak, but he also justified the use of nuclear weapon. He used stuff in his speeches such as it was essential to defend God's truth, that Russia and Ukrainian are one people, and connected it into the common national identity of both of them that he sees as religious one with the Orthodox Church. And once he framed this conflict as an existential threat, he kind of set the ground to the use of nuclear weapons. So he did directly after this were associated with a few costs. So first, some social costs from the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which was under the charge of the Russian Orthodox Church. But right after this, the head of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church detached himself and all of his between 11 to 12,000 churches from the Russian Church, and he said that Kirill is the one responsible for this, for justifying the war and the use of nuclear weapon, and they just do not want to be in touch with them. And therefore, all the Russian Orthodox Church influence, social influence on the Ukrainian Orthodox Church just disappear. Then there were some directly economic costs on Kirill. So the UK posed economic sanctions on him and directly said that it was because of this. And then the EU also drafted some sanction on him, but Hungary blocked this out. But still, it was, again, directly after his, what I will call religious signals and statements. And then he also suffered some political costs. So the World Council of Churches, which unite all the churches in the world, argue whether they should suspend the Russian Orthodox Church from them or not. And the Pope completely canceled any meeting that he had with him, meaning taking some of his political power out. But I would claim that there are also some moral and potential divine costs for this. So according to many scholars, mainly theological, but other scholars, says that when Kirill said that God is with us and conflicting the Orthodox Church values with this ethnic nationalism that we mentioned before, then he is sacrilege and kind of breaking the contract between him and God and between him and the religious community. And therefore, as a religious person, he might suffer from a divine punishment or some moral costs. So if you buy it, then the question is, first, I felt a bit uncomfortable with this at the beginning, because I thought that there are three pressing questions that we have to answer if relating to this example. First, why we should even consider him in IR. We said first, maybe you bought that state leaders can't send religious signals, but why we should care about him? Second, who exactly, so the leaders that can send religious signals? And finally, if a non-religious person, not like Kirill, that you see all the clothes and everything that signal how religious is, if non-religious send a religious signal, would he suffer from this divine cost that I added up or not? So we'll tackle one by one. First, so why we should care about him. There is already research now that show that these figures, religious authorities, have some positive effects on mobilization, recruitment, motivation, stress, moral dilemmas. They can do something. But you will say, but this is on the domestic level. It doesn't really matter for international level. I would say that you can take these influences that are so essential on the domestic level and put it out in the international level. Why? Because when you increase support and cooperation among the public, when you increase civilian morale before and during war as kind of a symbol of dedication of the religion to the nation, therefore you can gain all the stuff that you need in the international level during war. So for example, Demon's quote about the Orthodox Church, that he said that the Orthodoxy become more than religion. It become a measure of national identity. And therefore, these dudes have lots of influence within Russia, also in the international level. And it's not only about Russia, just to make it clear. This can also happen in both Iran, India, Israel, and even Japan during World War II with Shintoism. So I started to pick up some evidence also for this. Just make it clear it's not only about Russia. Okay, so let's say that we are taking also these leaders, religious leaders, as a potential center. So who exactly are, at the end, all those leaders that we'll consider as center of the religious signals? Going back to my definition of religious signals. So we already tackled the religious symbolism and we tackled the cost. So now we just go back to who is this center. So I would say that the senders of religious signals are leaders who publicly present some religious inclination. So on the international levels, the sender of the signals could be state and non-state leaders. So for example, leaders of terror organization like Hassan Nasrallah in Hezbollah. But on the domestic level, they could be, again, those state and non-state leaders who hold some domestic political power in the country, but it could also be Kirill, for example, so clerical leaders who have some religious authority in their country. And this distinction also yield some types of leaders. So it could be some, I would call it true religious people who both publicly but also privately practice religion. And it could be pseudo-religious, meaning they mainly present some religious inclination in public, but at the end, they don't really have any deep-seated faith in God. So the question now, going back to pressing question number 3, okay, so are these guys could really send religious signals credibly, meaning they might be suffered from this divine cause that you're talking about? I would say that yes. And I will show you the logic behind this, taking Putin's example that I promised before. So, would Putin suffer a divine cause for stating this? This quote is from the annual gathering of the International Russia Expert in 2018. And he referred here to a nuclear war between Russia and its enemies. And he says that an aggressor, so Russia's enemies, should know that the vengeance is inevitable, that he will be annihilated, and we would be the victims of the aggression. And we, right? He said we, so he referred to probably the Russian public will go to heaven as martyrs, and they will just drop dead. They will not even have time to repent. Okay, this is a dramatic pose. Okay, so the question now is whether Putin will suffer from any divine cause for stating this. The logic behind this, it doesn't really matter if like a strike will hit him or not. Because it doesn't really matter if he have a true deep-seated faith. What does matter is if the receivers of the signal will perceive this leader as a true religious type, meaning that they will think that if he will break the contract between him and God and between him and religious community, then he will suffer from this potential divine costs. Specifically about Putin, there is a complete disagreement about whether Putin is a religious person or not. But in practice, what he showed to others is that he has some religious inclination, and he constantly using this religious rhetoric in his statements. So, for example, he regularly do this pilgrimism that he showed before to sacred places. He revealed that on his airplane, he have an icon and a Bible, which he often reads. And when he specifically asked about his decision-making process, this is what he said, and I quote, that his decision-making process was driven by common sense based on moral principle, which in turn rests on religious values. So I don't know if the receivers bite or not, but he definitely publicly presents over and over again his religious inclination. So this is what I call religious signal. But the question is whether this is only about the Russia case that I told you, or how common is it in general also in Russia. So in Russia itself, when I picked up only Kirill and I picked up only nuclear weapons, specifically this connection between them, I find dozens of systematic public speeches of Kirill over and over again. And I set the bar pretty high that these speeches were brought to a very broad audience, and it was presented a very clear, not something that you can question about between nuclear and religion. And I find so many of them, there is some decrease in the last period, but my guess is that Kirill started to be the head of an organization in Russia, the Russian Council of Churches, and because he's the head of this organization, he just started to use this as a platform to send his religious signals and not just like do it himself in other occasions. So that's just to say that it's very common. It's not just one incident here, one incident there. So we have this definition and conceptualization of religious signals. We know it's common. And the question now is, so why? Why they are doing this all over again? And in other words, I will frame it as what effects do religious signals have on different audiences. And I will use Pakistan for this final case. Okay. So I'll first present you the different competing arguments on the different effects through different audiences, which refer to my dependent variable, which is the outcomes, possible outcomes from the signals, and then what the mechanism behind it. And then I will try to show you and convince you that you can see this in the Pakistan case. So there are 5 potential audiences, and hold yourself, there will be one audience that probably will shock you, but we're gonna win over this. There is the adversary that we all know, the ally, both in the international level. There are 2 in the domestic level, the public military troops, which I'm not sure that I will keep it or not, so would love to hear your thoughts on this. And there will be a 5th audience, which is the divine. And I will be considered as an audience. So all of these from the IR literature and this one from theological perspective, which I thought is important. I will show you what I'm going to claim that the outcome will be for it. So go one by one. For the adversary, the effect that you can achieve if you properly signal, religious signal, will be deterrence or coercion. And the mechanism behind it is kind of a mix of 3 claims in IR. First, costly signals of fear 97 with hentai. So there is all those costs that I showed you, that they are like, it's not a sunk cost, it's not that you're already suffering from this, but there are potential future costs that you are tying your hands with if you sacrilege this contract between you and God and you and your religious community. Second, when you kind of like involved religious rhetoric of like the doomsday machine, the end of the times, specifically like with nuclear weapon, there is kind of like a sense of like the madman theory of kind of like hold me back, and if not. So I think that there is something also with this. And there is also, when you use religious rhetoric, there is some moral language in it, which sets some moral dichotomy, meaning it just like leave less room for negotiation at the end. So I believe that a mix of 3 of them, which I would definitely love to hear your thoughts on, because it's changing literally like every week, is what I will call the adversary that you can achieve in front of an adversary when you send a religious signal. For an ally, you might increase support when you use religious signals. And the mechanism behind it will be a combination between Haidt's claim and book from 2011 that she showed that when you signal commitment, you can increase benefit mainly from the international community. And then I mix it up with some STR literature that says that when you signal devotion, you can make your religious community to revise their beliefs on how much trustworthy you are, and therefore you can increase support if they really believe in you. So it's kind of the mix of both of them. It follows kind of the same logic for the public. I just take Adamski's idea of religion, when you connect religion and national identity all together with this signaling devotion from STR that we just described, you can also increase support on the domestic level. And I'm not sure that I will call it exactly signal on the domestic level, but maybe religious communication. So we can talk about this more in Q&A. And then for the military troops, I'm taking Hassner's book that show that religious authority have all these positive effects and said that it can increase moral and combat resilience. And we know, for example, that Russia now in the battlefield could really use this as like increasing moral support, moral and combat resilience of its soldiers. And finally, the divine. I would say that when you use religious signals, you can kind of use this as a platform to signal devotion and the need for divine protection. This is a theological explanation. And think for yourself for a moment as a true religious people. So many times religious people really seek for these different channels in order to talk with God and signal something to God. And I think religious signals could also serve as something like this. So how do you find and analyze this effect that we are all seeing? So going back to signaling theory in IR, you identify the signal receivers, you then check how they interpreted the signal, how they responded, and did the response really match, right? But it's like so difficult because the senders don't really explicitly mention who are the target audience. Also, the receivers are not really cooperating. They are not usually publicly expressed whether they receive it, how they interpret it, and how they acted accordingly. And if I would go again to the Russia case, there are dozens and dozens of them. And if I really want to go all over this, I want to pick up something more specific that was really researched before. And therefore, just like pick one of them and hopefully show you that there is some proof of concept for my theory. So Pakistan Islamic bomb religious signals. I will show you first the signal, who is the sender, the type of the sender, the costs, and identify the receivers and whether there were long-term effects. And this is a spoiler. Bottom line is that the sender will be identified as pseudo-religious, but he publicly presents religious inclination. Yes, he might suffer some of these costs, even divine costs in the eye of the receivers. And I did find short and long-term effects for both of them. Okay, and hold on, this is the last part. Okay, so this is the Islamic box signal that all of the scholars that I've been reaching out and read agree that this is the beginning of the Islamic box signal. This is the former Prime Minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto in 1978, and it says as follows: the Christian, Jews, and Hindu civilization have this nuclear capability. The communist powers also possessed it. Only the Islamic civilization was without it, but that position was about to change. So just to make it short, I find out that this was official, it was public, there is a consensus that he intentionally tried to do this, and I think we can all agree it has some religious symbolism in it. The question is whether Bhutto was any real connection to religion. Originally, he had a liberal agenda in his country, but after India's test in 1974, when his public also became more religious at the time, he started to show some publicly religious conservatism. And then you would ask, okay, so what are the potential costs for this? So if he, in other words, gonna break the contract between God and him, so he presented publicly that he is religious, but he's not really, and the other receivers of the audience will kind of get it, that he's lying, then he could suffer some social punishment, first from the Muslim Ummah, because we saw here that he is broadcasting this not only his public, but to the Islamic civilization as.
But you notice he didn't say religions, he said civilization.
Right, yeah.
That's
true.
huge distinction.
Okay, thank you. So Muslim Ummah in general, but researcher in general does say that he also, one of his audiences, and we'll see it shortly, that one of his audiences were also other Islamic states. There were different goals for this. There was also social punishment, potential social punishment from the Pakistani public that become more and more religious. So he wanted to increase support But if they would think that he is secularist, then they might decrease supports. India at this time is the only country between the two that have nuclear weapons, so they might feel threatened and retaliate with nuclear or not, but this is an option, so a very potential high cost. And whether Bahudo is suffer from any divine cost, probably for him, not really, but it doesn't matter. It matters whether the receivers will perceive it as potential suffering from a divine cost or not. The literature raises three potential audience for this. First, India. Second, the Muslim states, for your question, and then the Pakistani publics. But there were also unintentional audiences, which were Western countries, including the US, UK, and Israel. And now for the short and long terms for each one of these. So for India, the literature showed that he tried to signal some threat to India in terms of based on religious distinction. And India indeed perceived this as threat signals. So it goes all the way back to right after this, like in 1979, the Pakistani Islamic bomb book that was published by a major general in the Indian army. And he opened his books with the quote that I just showed you, and he framed it as first indication of a Pakistani Arab ambition to build a nuclear bomb for Islam in general. This is only one evidence. I have tons of others who shows exactly this from statements of state leaders in India that perceive specifically the Islamic part as the most threatening thing compared to if they would call it like a Pakistani bomb, to the media in India that I think it was 138 times just saying Islamic bomb over and over again in the period of time of 15 years. But they are saying it over and over again, Islamic bomb instead of a Pakistani bomb. For the Muslim states, I find out that they perceive this, as Bahudo also wanted, as an Islamic quest. And therefore, they increase support in the short and long term. So, for example, in the long term, let's take it this time. So, in 1998, after the first Pakistani nuclear test, this was what was written in the Washington Post, that when the US announced its sanction against Pakistan, immediately Muslim nations rallied around Pakistan. And within days, they were stormed into Pakistan, like many of them, to voice economic and moral support. And this is years after, but it's still about Islam. For the Pakistani public, he wanted to raise Islamic pride, and he did. He increased support for the short and long term. You can see for the same incident in 1998, right after, people still on the street, right after the test, presenting models of the missile that states Islamic bomb. And it's also the imams in the mosque in Pakistan also connected it and said this is a miracle from Allah and for the Muslim nation. And finally, for the Western countries, which wasn't intentionally that they will receive it to feel threat, but Israel, for example, really was threatened by this. And I have some evidence from Begin's statements, historically said that Islamic bomb and what we're gonna do and ask for help from allies. And in the Western journal, it just led to kind of public hysteria. And I found out this, which was really exciting to find. This is a memo from the CIA, now this classified from 1979, so not long after this signal, that the subject is Islamic bomb. The question is, do we have any evidence of an Islamic bomb being developed by Pakistanis? I keep reading about this, and this is the head of the CIA back then. And this is only one evidence of tons of evidence, saying that even the director of the CIA is looking specifically on this Islamic part. So puts everything together for the bottom line. I did find some effects, both in the short and long term, for the religious signal of Islamic bomb of Pakistan. This is hopefully a proof of concept that there is something out there, but of course, there is much more research, and I will show you in the next slide where exactly I'm going to take it. But the bottom line, if you can achieve these different effects, so there might be some advantages to use religious signals. There might be then an answer to why those leaders use over and over again religious signals. And I separate it to tactical, strategic, and spiritual level. On the tactical level, you can increase combat resilience. On the strategic level, you might coerce or deter adversary. And and in front of like ally or the domestic public, you can increase support and cooperation. And finally, for religious people, it could have some advantages on the spiritual level, which is a channel to present devotion and the need for divine protection. Next steps. First, I really need to modify the mechanisms and really show that these are the specific mechanisms that we are trying. And I know that I'm not fully nailed it in this presentation for the Pakistani case, but this is like a work in progress, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this. Second, I'm working on creating a large data set of religious signals, and I can talk to you if you want on how exactly I'm doing this. And I thought that today we talked about the nuclear weapon, but I think that this phenomenon is much, much broader. And it's go from like the different domains of war. Specifically, I narrow it down to crisis because then I think credible signaling is the most essential thing. And then from nuclear, maybe to checking out in the conquering like domain of war, and then religious signals and terrorism too. So, yep. That's it. Thank you so much. And I will leave up this slide.
Thank you very much, Shira. That was just so super interesting. I'm sure everybody has a zillion questions. Lauren, maybe you can help me monitor people for questions.
Yeah. Jim has a question online.
So maybe let's do that. We'll start online first, and then in the room we'll alternate. So Jim, if you can unmute, go ahead and ask your question. Otherwise, you could type it in the chat. Jim Lamson's a senior staff person who's one of our Iran specialists. Go ahead, Jim.
Well, thanks so much. First, thanks so much for a fantastic presentation. This really feeds in a lot of ideas for my work on Iran. I have one possible example and then a question. So first, on the possible example, I don't know if you've seen this before, but your point about using religious terms and weapons names was very interesting. And you might know that Iran also uses what's called the Abjad system, which is it's like basically equivalent numbers to Arabic letters, and it will often use those numbers in its weapon systems as well as a signal. I don't know if it's a signal, but a costly signal or not, but it's something that might be an interesting example. So for example, the number 110, the number 313, the number 373, these all are mathematically, if you add up the numbers that are allocated to Arabic letters, these have religious significance. Like 110 is, if you use the math, it's Ali, for example. So I don't know if you've heard of this Abjad system being used by other countries as well. So that's just one example of something might be useful as an example. But my question is, in addition to signaling resolve, which I think you very persuasively
Jim, I think we just lost you for a second.
showed. Can religious signaling also be used? That is, its approach to military strategy, including deterrence. That is, can these signals be used to convey both intentions and capabilities? For example, Iran will often cites a lot of various Shia-based principles as part of its strategic culture. One is Gizas, which is retaliation, which is a big part, a big driver for decades for its military and deterrence strategy. So I guess with that, that's my question, and thanks so much for your presentation.
Thank you, Jim. Should I answer? Or
Yeah, why don't we do one at a time?
Sure.
So we're a small group. I think we can go one at a time.
Great. So thank you, Jim, first for the example. I didn't know about the numbers, so that was really helpful. So thank you for this. And regarding your question, I think it's an interesting question that I tried to tackle at some point for the past year and a half. And my conclusion back then that for intention, you can use religious signals in a way to signal intention and not only resolve. But I think that for the capabilities, that might be tricky and not really work because like to show like capability, so you're usually in the IR literature, you show you are making a nuclear test, you are like counting the weapons. There is kind of like, I think in like numbers in it, and I'm not sure that religious signals could achieve this, but I do think that they could achieve both resolve and intentions. And I think this is a good point to maybe distinguish between the two of them also in this research and explore them maybe separately. There might be some other mechanism that you should like use religious signals in a certain way in order to achieve this and not resolve. So thank you.
Avner, so you were moving your hand up.
Yeah, some very broad reflections, semi-philosophical. One of the first to say the issue is intriguing and full of area of research. So there is a great deal of fertile area to work and to look into. But there is a lot of word of caution. One of the premises in your thinking is you treat religion as a domain, reasonably well-defined domain. You somewhat try to put it in the metrics of IR as a current academic discipline. I think this is highly problematic. The separation between state of religion is relatively something new. It was born in the 16th, 17th century with the Reformations. Until then, religion was a very multifaceted human phenomenon that manifests itself in really the early signs of humanity. Burial rites, burial signs, in archaeological stuff much before actually writing. And you can attach a religious element or spiritual element or magic element, and all these words are somewhat not exactly complementary to each other, but relate to each other very early on with the very beginning of Homo sapiens. So to try and later on the three monotheistic religions, they were born in the last 2,000 years. I mean, Judaism a little before that, but essentially it's the last 3,000 or 4,000 years, with Islam the most recent one. Each of them was in a very specific semi-tribal civilizationary context. Each of them became in degree to a civilization. Often we talk about Judaic Christians as a broad encompassing. And it has multifacets of elements which in each different era, there the rise of nationalism is a 19th century phenomenon. There is always a sense of connection between a nation and something larger than what it is, which is, you can express it in religious terms. It doesn't have to be that you have to be a religious person, specifically believe in a specific God with any kind of divine or theological attributes. But for leader in moments of decision, especially decision that life of many of their people are involved, such as going to war and peace, you need to get some kind of blessing from something bigger than you, and you have the element of the religions which goes with the nation, which is the give its blessing to the nation. So to find that kind of discourse, that kind of talk is very, very natural, whether you are more religious person or less religious. You have something that goes with the nation, that give the thing to the nation. You find it with Israel, even though Israel leaders are mostly secular, they always use that kind of terminology. You find it with George Bush, who is a secular person, the way largely, even though, he may go to church and all that. So now about nuclear weapons, by the very nature, there is something apocalyptic about nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons, and think about Robert Oppenheimer. I mean, what his own comment, he was not a religious person. He was a person with a certain spiritual quest. He was a person with a certain sense of wonder. And seeing for the first time the flash of a nuclear weapons, of course, stimulate what he said, destroyer of worlds and all that kind of apocalyptic reference. Knowing that this is a single nuclear weapon, many nuclear weapons, for the first time humanity reached the point, the possibility to be a godlike instrument, a godlike power to bring its own end, something that was viewed as only God could do. So I think it's very important for you to start, and of course, neither Dima nor Hasler started with understanding of religion. I mean, it's specific studies in a specific point in time, but the people who like looking to from William James, and you said Marcel Mauss and people like that started much before that. The idea of profane and religion, which doesn't go to any specific, I mean, there are certain specific elements about religion, such as profane and sacred, which doesn't go to any specific religion, all religions have some element of that. So I think religion in general, the religious manifestation, the religious experiences are much deeper in terms of the human experience. Today, they're somewhat smaller because most of us, in most of our lives, we are secular and it doesn't play a major role. But there are moments, and leaders may deal with this moment, such as going to war, wages of war, and of course, nuclear weapons, that it's just human to invoke something which is larger than you, so it's religion. So to try to tame the complexity of the religious experience into some very specifics in IR theory, there is a great deal of danger. I'm not saying that it's not intriguing enterprise to try to do something like that, but I propose to you to start with a certain kind of humility and respect to the complexity, to the history, the huge history, to the legacy of the religious experience, which is much earlier and before, and it's Pramaic, it's much deeper than some elements of signaling or receiving that we see. And this is just a broad way I have to look. It's a very multifaceted things. And the fact that we, all of us, when we face death, we use reference to pray. A moment that we don't have much to do, we say we pray as a reference to hope. So I wouldn't take it as an aspect of religion per se, definitely not institutional religion, but simply the humility of being human, what we can and cannot do when we are facing certain kind of situations. So the religious domain is not exact domain, it's meshed to so many aspects of the human experience. And when you try to define it, you realize that it goes to so many other things. It's not something that can easily fit into the terminologies and the things of IR. This was very broad.
So I'm not sure there's a question there per se, but Avner
It's a word of caution.
Yes, articulated, I think, in a very good way, some of the classic methodology debates that are always, happening in our field between, can you do a sort of positivist social science design where you isolate certain things and this is an independent variable, and this is a dependent variable, and I test for, causal relations, versus do you need a more cultural, contextual, interpretive approach that sees the thing in its whole. So if you want to react to that, you can, or you can just take it as notes.
First, thank you. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And because I do take religious studies also, I'm a political scientist, but I do take religious studies very seriously. I've been taking for the past couple of years a few courses that specifically, for example, tackle these notions of profound and sacred in the history department in Berkeley, which was really good. There is no theological department for this.
I had the pleasure to not study under, but to attend Marcel Iliad, who is one of the, he's dead now, but he was at the University of Chicago in the 70s. He was a Romanian scholar who studied a lot of stuff on
Super.
that.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with you. This is a version, I think my first draft of this idea was incorporating many those like religious notions and idea that were not IR at all. And then as I got more and more feedback from IR scholars to move it on to the dependent variable, independent variable. So I don't know if I departed from this, but I took maybe one step back. But as I think your comment is very helpful because we are every time taking one step forward, two step back, three step forward. So I think that's good in the term of like going back to this conceptualizing religion and taking this cautiously again.
Especially when you define it as domain, because
Yeah.
it's not exactly domain. It could be domain in a very specific context that you have to specify. Because you could, the danger is mixing up a lot of things, which in some sense they're religious, but in some other sense they're spiritual. They're more than just religious in a specific domain thing. So that's a question.
Thank you.
And in the context of Israel, do you know the work of Rachel Lior?
No,
You don't?
no.
You should. She is,
Right.
at the Hebrew University, one of the biggest historian of religion in general and that kind of stuff. You should look at her.
No, thank you.
If you want, I'll share his email with you and you can send her some references. Other questions? Any of the students in the room? Yeah, go ahead, Satyajit.
Historically speaking, what do you think are the effects and costs on an adversary and or an ally or the public when a leader comes up with the religious symbolism to define an objective, but then fails to meet that objective? For example, Anwar Sadat and all those other Arab leaders, they used religious symbolism to justify their wars against Israel. But then in 1967 and in the Yom Kippur War, they lost very decisively. So what was the effect?
Thank you for the question. I do think that with signals in general, they are aiming to achieve certain goals. But with signals, you can signal some stuff, but at the end, it might not really make the receiver to revise their beliefs. Or if they revise their belief, it doesn't mean that necessarily they will act accordingly as you wanted. So I think that the example that you pick up, which was good, does give an example of maybe religious signals that at the end didn't yield the desired outcome, but it doesn't mean it wasn't a failure per se, because I think in order to measure it, whether it was a success or failure, you should go into I had this slide of like how to measure this effect. So you need to detect exactly the signal, who are the receiver, how they perceived it, how they evaluated, and then how they acted, and whether it was aligned with your goal, initial goal or not. So maybe it stuck at some point in this process and didn't went all the way through, but this is how it is in signals with general. And I think it's the same case with religious signals. Yeah, I hope it's answered your question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions? Grace.
Yes, I have a question. Thank you. My name is Grace Smith, and I'm an NPTS student here at Middlebury with a focus on the United States and Russia relations. I'm very interested in your topic. And I have this question. I wrote it down, if you don't mind me just kind of referring to my notes here. It's my personal thought that here in America, we have this deeply ingrained Christianity that informs almost every aspect of our daily life. But so one of those sectors would be our foreign policy. And an example of what I'm talking about would be there's this common idea, I think, that's just easily accepted by the population and the leaders, that we ought to be spreading our particular form of democracy throughout the world, even if it requires violence, because we know better than everybody else that this is the best way to govern yourselves. And it is remarkably similar, in my opinion, to some of the early Christian missionary projects that even used violence or eradicated other cultures in the process of evangelizing them, because the idea was, well, we're saving your eternal soul. Like we know what's better here. Our way is better than yours, even if it results in death. So my point in bringing that up is that I think that there's religious signaling here in the States that takes place between leaders and the population that is on a level that's not explicit, because we all already acknowledge and know this shared foundation of Christianity. It's like in the blood. And my question to you would be, what do you think about this concept that I'm talking about? And do you think it exists in other countries where there may have been a long tradition of a certain religion? And will your study encompass things like this that are not so explicit? You know, it's not like spoken language in a speech that would be, maybe it would be much more difficult to track. I don't know.
That's a terrific question, Grace. And if I can just piggyback on it briefly before Shira answers, you know, it might offer a middle ground between what sort of Avner was saying and how Shira is setting up her dissertation, because to me, you're reminding me a lot of the strategic culture literature, which is, you know, countries develop certain approaches to nuclear strategy and nuclear doctrine because they are the country they are, and you know, a whole host of factors, their political ideology, their past history, their prevailing religion, you know, create this stew that's just in the back of the minds of all decision makers before they do anything, that's influencing them in ways which might not be articulated, you know, explicitly. So yeah, that might be an interesting thing to react to.
Thank you. I think that this is definitely a thing. And when I started this research, I referred to these two very easy examples, like Pakistan and Russia, and I think also Iran. They are like the easy example of just like, yeah, of course you can see religious signals. They are using it. It's like it's more explicit part of the country in Russia from the fall of the USSR. And I was picked up again and again on whether cases not so explicit, such as the US, also France will be such a case. Would you see religious signals in them or not? I didn't have the chance yet to really go in depth into those cases, but my hunch and the cases that I did pick so far do suggest that this like less explicit way of using religious could also be prominent in a way, but I just think that it will take a bit of a different form. So it might, as you said, like not be so explicit, even though I think the President Bush speech was very, like, that was like a very excited example when I picked it out. It was like, so yeah, this is a religious signal, that's great. But I'm sure that when I dive in more into those cases as US and France, it will be harder sometimes to pick it up. But I did, for example, for France, which I think it's even a harder case than the US because they really separate religion from state. I'm working on a project with Dima Adamski that we mentioned before on the potential influence of the Catholic Church in France on the nuclear enterprise. And I was at the beginning like probably nothing. But when I really dug in, I saw that there are some connection also in there. So it might be our maybe Western, sometimes like non-religious perspective that give us the hunch that it's maybe not really there, or like even if it's like unexplicit, so it's not really influenced today in 2024. But I really agree with you that these unexplicit things for us today might be more explicit than we think.
Everything,
Yeah, thank you for this insight.
You're welcome, and thank you for your response.
I might go ahead and exercise chair's prerogative at this point. I'm not sure I have questions, but I have sort of just a few comments, suggestions for you. And if you want, I can, type these up more formally and send you an email later. I might actually start with a quick note on George W. Bush. Avner sort of said he thought he was largely secular, but, George W. Bush was a born-again Christian. He, when he was young, had some serious alcohol and drug abuse problems and basically got himself out of that by finding religion. So I think his religious beliefs were actually quite deep and sincere, at the time he was president. Whereas, we're going to hear Donald Trump invoke God and Christianity a lot, but it's going to be utterly insincere. Right? He's a completely secular, person, and it's all cynical. So let me start with that. I love this topic. I'm really glad I invited you to come give the talk. Sometimes I think great projects are what I think of as finding things that are hidden in plain sight. And this feels very much like that. Like, I think we've all heard leaders, mention God or invoke religion. And we've sort of thought of it as just, so much noise, right? That it's in sort of statistics terms, it's part of the error term, right? It's not one of the causal factors that's driving things. It's just kind of chatter that's, in the background. And I think you've made a really, really, really compelling case. Like, no, we should take this stuff seriously. There's some intentionality behind it. There's some potential real world consequences of it. So I think your intuition is spot on, and it's a really good project. I think there are some tweaks you could make to the sort of dissertation that hopefully would help you. Although I know you're going to get, every committee member will have their own set of advice. And really, the best thing to do is satisfy your committee so you can finish. But within the parameters of that, I have some thoughts for you. I think your current definition of a religious signal is too elaborate, and it ends up being a little tautological to me. Like, if you have a theory that religious signals are costly and that's why they convey resolve, you don't want to put cost and resolve in the definition. Like, you have to separate your cause from its effects and its causal mechanism. So I would go for a more streamlined definition, just like it's a publicly made statement of religion that contains symbolism and maybe is connected to some statement of commitment or something like that. But you try to take things like cost and resolve out of the definition. It seems to me
there is always certain words being used. They're to a degree religious, but they're not fully religious. For example, when leader says, "With God helps," Be'ezrat Hashem, is it religious? Not religious? Well, it's referred to something larger than us as humans, but it's not.
But I think for her purposes, it is, right? Not everybody talks God talk.
But it's not truly God. I mean, it's more national collective dog as something that's.
Well, it's just a punctuation mark.
Yeah. Well, in part that's why you do the research, right? Is this making a difference or not? So I think that you've got two, potential causal mechanisms going on here that I could see, right? So one is drawing on Fearon's work, right? Where making religious statements to me creates a type of domestic audience costs, in the tying hands vein, right? And so one question I had is actually just, are you thinking of this as a subcategory, like this is one of the forms of domestic audience costs, or you think this is an alternative, like this is different from Fearon's, version? But the other causal mechanism, and I don't know if you know this literature, it would be from the literature on sacred values. Scott Atran, I think he's a sociologist, anthropologist, but has come up a bit in the terrorism literature that sacred values are things that are beyond material cost benefit calculation, that are beyond compromise, right? They're so core to a person's identity and value commitments that you don't negotiate about them. And so the flip sort of example that people give is that, you know, you wouldn't expect to be able to offer to pay somebody money to change their religion and get a positive response, right? They'd be offended, they'd be angry.
Not transactional.
Right, it's not transactional, it's a sacred value, right? And so, you know, I think one or both of two things is going on here when people invoke religion, right? And one is that by saying it out loud, you're creating certain commitments for which there will be an audience cost priced later on if you violate the commitment, right? And the other is that you're signaling, I think this gets a little closer to resolve here, you're signaling that for me, this issue is not just a normal bargaining issue where I'm negotiating with you and we're going to split the difference. Like, you know, this is an issue where I want the whole thing, right? And compromise is unthinkable. So, you know, you might have different causal mechanisms you can play with. You know, in terms of the consequences of this, I think there's two different kinds of consequences. So one potential set of consequences is in the realm of coercion, right? I'm bolstering the credibility of my deterrent or compellant threat, you know, by making some signals that I'm not going to back down. But it seems to me that a lot of the cases that you mentioned really have a lot more to do with domestic legitimacy. Like I think, you know, in Pakistan, the whole Islamic bomb rhetoric, you know, that's mostly about building up public support domestically for the bomb and maybe, you know, hoodwinking the Saudis into sending some money. You know, and it's not, I'm not sure anybody else is being signaled for deterrent, you know, purposes from that, right? It's like, it's legitimizing the bomb program with domestic and friendly international, you know, audiences. So I guess my final comment / question, I think this one really is a question. I'm not yet persuaded how effective this is. Like in all the examples that you mentioned, I don't see anybody being deterred by this. You know, Ukraine's still fighting on despite what Patriarch Kirill said, and the West is still sending aid, right? India, Israel went ahead doing exactly what they're doing after Pakistan, you know, floated the Islamic bomb. So finding evidence of impact, I think, is going to be tricky here.
Thank you. This is really helpful. I will go from maybe the end.
In any order you want, and you don't have to answer all of them.
Yeah, I will pick a few. This is really helpful. To how tricky to see whether it's effective or not. Completely agree. I would guess that once I will crack down exactly how the mechanism is look like, it will be easier maybe to detect it. I thought that the Pakistani case, maybe as you mentioned, that one of the consequences is domestic legitimacy. I think I could really see that it's effective for this. I do agree that I wasn't able to completely show that it helps for coercion, and I will tackle this down the road.
One alternative is to broaden your dependent variable. So you've got, you know, it has observable effects here, but less observable effects here. So that, because you don't want to have all negative results. So that would give you a chance at some positive results.
Sure. Yeah, I agree with you. I will say, like, once I will build up this data set of religious signals, then I could pick up, and I might, for each one of those larger domains, try to also show the different consequences and to see whether they are really effective at the end or not. Thank you for the Scottatron. I know his work, but I didn't know his specific sacred value literature. So this is really helpful, and I think it's really picking up some of my less IR.
Yeah. I mean, it seems to me it really fits here, what you're doing.
Yeah, I agree. This is really helpful. And to points on Firon, going from back. So when I presented this in the ISA, the conference that we have met, then one of the members in the audience said, "So you're picking up head tying of Firon?" And I didn't figure it out on.
And he was a
until this
Berkeley
point.
PhD student
Right.
too, you know.
Yeah.
I worked with Bob Powell.
Yeah, right. So I thought this is kind of like, if I do think that the mechanism of fear is working out there, and this is just like another type of it. I don't know if it's like supplemental for this, but I think it's just like a different type.
That's my instinct too. It's a subtype of domestic audience cost.
Yeah.
Yes, Sharad?
Can I just do comments instead of questions?
Yes, I guess I set the precedent for that.
One of the comments was you made, Jeff, about the Pakistani case about legitimacy, because if you see the history from the 70s, and Bhutto by no means was religious by any definition, but that you see this this long history where at each stage, whether it's Bhutto or Zia after him, or Musharraf, but especially with Zia and Bhutto, the instrumentalization of religious rhetoric as a way of gaining legitimacy in the absence of actual legitimacy, especially with Zia. And there, I don't know if you've taken a look at the book by Heather Nizamani. He used to be a postdoc here at CNS.
I was in Maryland, Baltimore.
I think so, yeah, but way back. This was so Heather's book, which I'm guessing he must have completed at CNS, looks at public opinion and as well as the history of the Pakistani nuclear program. And since I have a list of a couple of writings, there's also the book by the edited volume by Sohail Hashmi and Stephen Lee, your friend, which is Ethics and Weapons of Mass Destruction, because that has some really fascinating chapters on theological debates and how theological interpretations are often exploited by different actors. And if you're looking at just the South Asia bit, there's another great edited book by E.T. Abraham called South Asian Cultures of the Bomb. And that is a really unique book with some really fascinating chapters of how after 98, not so much before, how after the 98 tests, nuclear weapons sort of exploded onto the public scene, so to say. And so they became part of culture, and they weren't really part of the public discourse before 98. So which brings up issues about audiences. If the audience itself is not fully aware about the magnitude of these weapons, then how important is it for them? Just to speak a bit more about the Pakistani case. I mean, I've always thought that the whole Islamic bomb idea before 98 was a little overplayed. I mean, Stansfield Turner's question was apt, to what extent is this an Islamic bomb? And that was 79. But the book that I was mentioning to you guys, to Abner, I think it was Robert Windrum and someone else from NBC News. So they actually wrote the book, The Islamic Bomb. And it was, to me, the question has always been whether it was driven by an Islamist ideology or was it for nationalistic strategic purposes.
I think the answer is the second.
And so I've always felt that it was kind of the second, because even with Zia, who was much more religious personally than Musharraf, who was fairly secular, it wasn't so much the Islamist ideology, although it was very much present in his thinking, but it was instrumentalization of the religious rhetoric for gaining political legitimacy amongst the different political actors, like the Islamist political parties, which were getting all of these favors from him. And that often gets confused, that is it a religious Islamist ideology or is it a nationalist thing? I mean, just to sort of extend that point, if you look at, for instance, the strategy of state sponsorship of terrorism, by successive Pakistani leaders, that strategy continued regardless of whether the leaders were necessarily religiously oriented or not. whether it was Zia or Benazir Bhutto or Nawaz Sharif or Pervez Musharraf. So you have a pretty wide variation there in terms of their religious personal beliefs, but the strategy continued. So to me, it gets me to think that, maybe there's more nationalism there, but disguised with some religious rhetoric in order to appeal to multiple audiences, and at the same time get some religious plus points and legitimacy. So to me, it's more the instrumentalization of it, which I think is necessary. And the point that Jeff made, I think that that the senders are responding to domestic situations, or domestic stakeholders who they are concerned about. So a sort of a, holier than thou attitude, which could be a great name for a paper as well. If you look at, if you look at Saddam Hussein also, to just go further, towards the end of his, career, if you will. Why didn't he really give in, in the period before 2003 and just say, okay, everyone just come in and check what I have. Part of his problem was credibility and legitimacy within the system. That amongst his coterie and amongst the different stakeholders within the Saddam regime, he needed to project strength. So that's another way of thinking about the instrumentalization of nuclear weapons, whether it is for religious stuff or nationalism or for regime protection.
One footnote to what Shiraz just said, which is an issue which is intriguing, and to the best of my knowledge, we don't have a full understanding of that. That's empirical, that relates very much to IR. It's really understanding the nature of the Pakistani-Saudi relationship vis-a-vis nuclear weapons, and to what extent in the parent agreement, again, it's agreement that it's talked about, but I don't know if anybody actually saw it. What's the motivation and how much it's the questions of this protections has to do with with the Islamic sites by Pakistan. What was the religious element of that? That's kind of empirical and specific issue, which I don't think we have a full answer to this day.
I think every couple of years, Simon Henderson writes a piece on exactly this, on the Pakistani-Saudi relationship.
Yes.
I think the Pakistanis played the Saudis pretty well on this, because it was more nationalism, but they made it like an Islamic
alliance
project. But then you also had somebody like Gaddafi, who was also a supporter of the Pakistani program, and not quite a religious figure, but he very much used religious rhetoric to bolster his position. So all of them had their own motivations. For the Saudis also, was it explicitly religious or was it regime protection?
But in the Islamic world, you find leaders that their rise was quite secular. And from time to time, later on as the leaders, they are using religious moment. It's not just Saddam. Even Sisi recently had some religious rituals in his political performance. You find it Gaddafi, who was completely secular initially, and he had all these moments too. So, it's kind of strange. But
I think you guys are sort of making Shira's point for her, which is right. There's a puzzle here.
Yeah.
Why is everybody talking religion? Even the ones who are utterly secular are talking religion.
I know, because there is something about the culture, because I think in Islam and the Islamic civilization, the relationship between states and religions are the least separated and the most kind of connected and entangled.
Well, I'm keeping one eye on the clock here. So last point from you, and then I'll give Shira the last
One of
word.
the points you made, Jeff, about the effectiveness bit, which kind of troubled me also when I was writing my piece, that how do I see whether it is having any effect or not, and there just wasn't any way for me to figure it out. But I thought, is that even necessary? You know, I mean, is the evidence of impact so essential? I mean, you just study it from the perspective of those who are using it as a strategy itself. I think that itself is a contribution, even if the evidence of the impact of this strategy is not all that obvious.
Yes, Sachin, real quick.
Yeah, coming to effectiveness, and in Russia's case particularly, can't we argue that Putin's statements on Christianity, especially in our recent context, are aimed at the Republican Party so that they don't send aid to Ukraine?
Well, that's a clever one. Like, yeah, I'm anti-gay just like you, standing up for the old school version of Christianity.
Might be.
All right, you get that was a lot
Sure.
to respond to. So pick and choose what you want to respond
all.
to. Well, we'll have lunch also, so we can continue
Right,
the
yeah.
conversation.
Thank you for all the comments. Thank you for the book recommendations. I would definitely pick them up. I think your point on the use of religion as like instrumental, it's really the point, and kind of like connecting everything together. I think when I'm talking about true religious or not true religious doesn't really matter what the audience perceived or not. I think it frame it kind of like tying up back together and frame it. So thank you. This is very helpful. And also to your last comment on the effect might be a solution at the end for the coercion. I will go like full power of trying to really find the effect for also coercion and deterrence. But I think that's a good point if at the end, after the whole time of the PhD and writing the book, it's not really, to frame it that way. I think it's also a really important contribution as also to the question before, like what's the effect at the end? This is signals in general. Sometimes your audience doesn't really do what you wanted them to do, but it's still a signal. It doesn't mean it was effective if they try to revise it and think about what you try to convey. I think also almost at time.
Perfect. Well, why don't we thank our speaker one more time for a great